Whoa, calm down. G'day everyone, welcome back to A Legal Studies Teacher Reads the News. A consumer's options look today, and we've had this report here by Tom Rabe. This is updated on the 19th of June at 3:09 p.m. after being first published at 10:45, and it's talking about Sydney peak hour pricing window. So basically what's happened is the New South Wales government, the Minister, Andrew Constance, has extended peak hour where you pay more for your fare by 3 hours. Let's have a look at why. The peak hour pricing window will be widened by 3 hours per day on Sydney's public transport network, increasing Opal fares for thousands of commuters. New South Wales Transport Minister Andrew Constance announced the major changes to the transport pricing system on Friday as the government attempts to spread the commuter load and maintain social distancing amid the COVID-19 pandemic. The changes mean close to 20% of all trips, that's based on a number, 220,000 pre-COVID, per day, will be subject to increased peak hour pricing, according to the government. While more people will soon be subject to peak hour prices, the government will also halve fares during off-peak periods, i.e. 10 to 3 p.m. The government has also maintained most of its peak travel fares, despite the independent pricing regulator recommending a 5% increase for each of the next 4 years. Mr. Constance said the increase to peak hour was to encourage more commuters to retime their trip during the coronavirus crisis. The challenge we've had is we've had a high concentration of commuters on the shoulder of the peak. So if we're really going to see a step in change, sorry, I'll try that again. If we're really going to see a step change in terms of timing of the day, that's why we're putting it in, he said. I think that's fair. We're trying to keep people safe, keep people apart. Under the pricing regime, a person travelling from Penrith to Town Hall at 6:30 a.m. will have their fare increased from $4.82 per trip to $6.89, meaning their morning commute increased by more than $10 per week, and $20 if they also need to travel in the afternoon peak. So that is certainly a substantial change. If you're working $48 per year, we're talking $840 more for every day if you do your 4 weeks annual leave, although I'm not a maths teacher, so that's just off the top of my head. Apologies if that's wrong. Let me know in the comments. But Mr. Constance said the fare restructure would be good news for 85% of commuters, with the discount in place between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. The Transport Minister said the government had lost hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue during the lockdown due to massive drops in patronage. He said any increase to revenue off the back of the fare change would be minor. I expect that if we see any increase, it will be very much a rounding error. We've seen such an enormous drop in revenue, Mr. Constance said. Opposition Transport Minister Chris Minns said widening the peak pricing window was a cash grab by the government, targeting working commuters, particularly those in western and outer metropolitan areas of Sydney. Using COVID-19 as an excuse to make commuters pay more is a disgrace, he said. He said the government had failed to understand that many working people could not restructure their commute. What exactly does Gladys Berejiklian expect working people to do? Get up at 4 in the morning or start work at midday? Mr. Minns said. The pricing scheme will come into effect on July 6 and run for 3 months. After that, the government says a permanent 30% discount for off-peak travel will be introduced on buses and light rail in line with what is already in place for trains and metro services. While most fares are either being discounted or staying the same, the government will increase the cost of shorter bus and light rail trips in a bid to keep people off public transport. Aside from the 3-month 50% discount, the Opal fares will remain in place for at least one financial year before the government reviews it. Around 900,000 commuters were riding Sydney's public transport per day this week, compared to more than 2 million prior to the lockdown. The system dropped to about 20% capacity during April, the lowest patronage in almost a century. So, this is about consumers. It's about the government changing how much the pricing of an essential service of people getting to work is and their reasoning behind it. So first of all, looking at the syllabus, what could this be talking about? Well, we're surely thinking through this idea of compliance and non-compliance when it comes to the government and their pricing. You may have noticed that. It says the government has also maintained most of its peak travel fares despite the independent pricing regulator recommending a 5% increase for each of the next 4 years. I'll get back to that in a second. Laws relating to consumers is a reflection of changing values and ethical standards. So this question of how much you can charge for an essential service, for transport. The CBD, remember, has nowhere near enough parking facilities. So if you're going to force people to work in there, you have to ask the question, what is the government doing to allow people to work in the city? That is what the opposition Transport Minister, Chris Minns, is saying. He claims this is a cash grab, that commuters who have no choice, especially if they work in outer metropolitan areas or Western Sydney, they have no choice but to catch public transport in there. There's no parking for them, and it would take so long and cost so much to drive into the CBD that they simply don't have a choice. This is countered by, well, I guess that is a counter, the initial claim being made by the New South Wales Transport Minister, Andrew Constance here, is he is using these price measures to try and influence consumer behaviour. He's actually saying we need less people on the trains, and too many people were waiting till the last minute and buying their ticket right on the shoulder, right just before peak time hit, so they could save money. So they might work around and leave a little bit early for their work or a little bit late from their work so they can catch that time and save some money. So what has he done? He's extended the peak time, hoping that more people will do that again and that less of the shoulder kind of peak time would occur. More people would perhaps go just a little bit later again. All those people that are making trips that were going to go at X time are now going to go at X plus an hour, so they save themselves money. So it's interesting. It's this idea of the government trying to change consumer behaviour through the structuring of the cost of transport. So a few different kind of concepts there. If we're thinking about this, obviously this is a state government organisation that we're about to look at, the regulator, and the question of, the role of the media. The media has allowed Andrew Constance to have his say, and they've also called up Mr. Minns and said, "What do you think about this?" And he's able to have his say. And then we're asking these questions of, well, is this a question of are they kind of ripping off customers here, or is it a good deal? And that gives us the independent pricing regulator. So I just looked it up. This is what you can always do. If you read something like this in the paper, you're not sure what it is, just Google it. I looked up independent pricing regulator, Trains New South Wales. I come to IPART. This is IPART. IPART determines the maximum fare increases for buses, trains, light rail, and ferry services for metropolitan, regional, and some rural transport. We determine a reference price for wholesale ethanol used in making E10 fuel, so how much they're charging for ethanol, so that you're cutting it with your petrol to make your petrol kind of last longer, and monitor the retail marker for E10. We also make recommendations on maximum taxi and private ferry fares and regulate the prices charged for access to rail infrastructure. So note that, access to rail infrastructure. In other words, the guys that are using our network, the network is owned by the state government. And so they're accessing it, and these guys are regulating how much they're charging people for access to that. Okay, and if you have a look, transport fares, July 2020, Opal fare changes. That's what we're going to look at. Ethanol, etc. Transport reviews, Opal fares from 1st of July, or taxi fares, number of licenses, etc. Rail accesses, frequently asked questions, papers and reports. So these guys report to government. So if we look at frequently asked questions, what does it stand for? What does it do? Our core functions are conferred by legislation, delegations, rules, and access regimes established by legislation. They are to set or recommend maximum prices for monopoly services in New South Wales. In other words, there is only one state rail service. I can't catch a different train into the CBD. And so IPART has been set up through legislation to ensure that this monopoly service does not rip off consumers. It's government setting up an independent regulatory body to ensure that people do not get ripped off. Okay, it's looking out for the little guy. It literally is, and that's laws relating to consumers as a reflection of changing values and ethical standards. The idea that you can't run a monopoly that isn't heavily regulated, otherwise they'll charge way too much. It's a very good idea, and a whole bunch of other stuff they do as well. It's all there. And this is the report. And you'll see status review completed, start date July 2018, end date July 2020. For those more astute amongst my viewers, you'll note the draft report, December 2019, when it was in draft reform and pretty much ready to go. A huge hiccup happened about 20 days later. Along came COVID-19. So there's a public hearing summary that was released on the 11th of February. But everything that happened following that, we're dropping, remember, 20% capacity. So 80% of people weren't taking the trains while this final report was happening. So what are they going to say in this? They've released it in June today. That's their proposal. In February this year, IPART finished its review of the Opal fares. New South Wales government has now released its decision on our recommendations. So note that the government's decision on their recommendations. We decided at the time that the government could increase fares by an average of 5% per year over the next 4 years. So note that they are the regulatory body. They've said they can increase fares by an average of 5%. The government's chosen not to do that, basically because they've said, well, no one's using it. It's not going to matter too much, but they've taken the ability to increase offset by expanding off-peak discounts and broadening the availability of concession fares. So they've done that, but they've also taken the decision to widen that window, peak time. COVID-19 pandemic has significantly changed the situation. People are being encouraged to work from home in the community to limit travel on public transport to essential journeys. The public is also being encouraged to consider alternatives, including walking and cycling. This requires a different approach not contemplated by us or the people we consulted through the review. So if you're these guys, you'd be pretty unhappy. Like you've done all this time in this review, you're about to set an idea, and then a global pandemic happens. Hopefully, you'd obviously be much, much unhappier with the idea that people are getting sick and dying. But most of your recommendations here that you've been working on simply don't make sense anymore. So this requires a different approach, and we think it's appropriate the New South Wales government takes the current circumstances into account when considering what fares to set. So the regulatory body has inserted into their final report, COVID's happened, and we really think that you should make decisions that you think are best based on that, not based on our report necessarily. IPART proposed the increases be offset by introducing off-peak fares on bus, etc. So they're going to do that to assist with dealing with crowding at peak times. In other words, it's an incentivized program. You're making peak time more expensive and you're making off-peak time less expensive. It's that process I mentioned, that idea of going, we need to make people want to catch the train when less people are around, to encourage people to work in a way that minimizes their contact with everyone else and maximizes social distancing. We also recommend they discounted fares to New South Wales residents who hold a current Commonwealth, etc., etc. Okay, so hopefully that's just a helpful little example for consumers of looking at how an independent regulatory body works and why it's around, because we have a monopoly, including Sydney Water and public transport. And for that, we need to therefore regulate maximum prices for energy retailers, for gas prices, for licensing and authorization of water, etc., etc. So they do a whole bunch of stuff, and they're there to ensure that consumers are looked after. All right? If we're thinking through the principal focus here, this is a legal right of consumers to have an independent body ensuring that prices are regulated heavily if a monopoly exists, and hopefully if it do it well, that's the effectiveness of the law there in achieving justice for the consumer. Thanks for holding on till this late, guys, and good luck with your exams.